Hi there, Year 13, and welcome to our lesson. As you can see, the title of that lesson is To What Extent Did Attitudes Change in the Early 1900s? We've spent quite a bit of time looking at the period 1865 to 1900, and we've looked at reservation policy, and we've looked at allotment policy in quite some detail. We obviously gave you some context as well before that by looking at some of the changes that affected Native Americans around 1865. We're now going to accelerate the course in terms of about 20 to 25 years and think about the early 1900s. And by that I mean the 1900s and the decades of the 1910s and the 1920s. Your first job though is just to do a bit of retrieval as normal. So at this point, pause the PowerPoint and spend 2 minutes trying to answer these 7 questions. So pause the PowerPoint now. Okay, you've had a go at those 7 questions. Here's the answers that you should have got. Fill in any blanks that you might have had, or any incorrect answers that you gave need to be corrected. Number 1, in what year was the Medicine Lodge Treaty signed? You should have 1868. So the Medicine Lodge Treaty is 1868. Secondly, the word nomadic means a group of people who have no permanent fixed residence or abode or home. So in the Native Americans case, you know that the Plains Indians lived in teepees, temporary structures that could be collapsed and rebuilt, and they followed buffalo herds before policies of the federal government started to mean they had to be fixed. Number 3, what act was passed in 1862? That's the Homestead Act. And then 4, in what year did the US government decide to impose reservations on Native Americans? That's 1871. In 1869, they'd made the decision to no longer negotiate treaties with Native Americans, and from 1871, reservations will be imposed. 5, it's true, polygamy was banned on reservations. This is all part of the Americanization or assimilation process, getting these Native Americans to conform to American culture and standards. Number 6, you could have said any of the following for one other Native American way of life that was ended on reservations. Herbal remedies, they could no longer be mixed by medicine men. Tribal laws and tribal councils, they were replaced by US laws in theory. The power of the tribal chief was removed and Indian agents took their place. You could have talked about how braves were no longer able to hunt and show their skill. Any of those would be appropriate. And then lastly, in terms of cattle grazing, so not farming but cattle grazing, it was 320 acres given to the Dawes Act. Give yourself a mark out of 7 and then we'll move on. Now, for the early part of the 1900s that we're now moving on to, I just want to talk about this concept for a moment. This man is Israel Zangwill, and he wrote something, a play in fact, with this quote in it. America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. If you don't know what a crucible is where you melt gold. It gets incredibly hot, incredibly intense. It's where you can melt precious metals and then reshape them. And Israel Zangwill compares America to a crucible, a melting pot, where different people of different races are kind of melted down and reformed into the American nation. This was best seen in his play called The Melting Pot of 1908. And his play is a reaction to the fact that the early 1900s sees huge numbers of immigrants arrive to the United States of America. We can't describe this as kind of a second wave of immigration because people have always moved to America to form a new life in this new country. But by 1910, up to 13.5 million immigrants are living in the USA. And the point is this: therefore, America as a nation has to kind of create its own identity from the fact that it's made up of hundreds of different groups of people who already have an identity that they've brought with them. I think that's why Americans, even to this day, are so keen to gather around things like flags and anthems and oaths and the American dream. It's because it's still a relatively new nation. Here's the key theme for us though. For the American government, the challenge is, how do you get all of these different immigrants with all of these different backgrounds to be one nation? And for African Americans who are already in America, well, they want to be part of that. They want equality with other immigrants and other groups so they can be treated American. Native Americans, though, are different because they have no desire to be American at all. And they have demonstrated a consistent resistance to any integration, and they have continued to claim to be separate. So we've got an American government who's trying to assimilate all of these different immigrant groups with all of their different backgrounds into one nation, with flags and oaths and anthems and patriotism. But then we've got this one group, this indigenous group, who do not want to be American at all. Therefore, by the early 1900s, we have Native Americans starting to try and assert those differences and fight for them, in albeit small ways, but still significant ways. One of the first ways is the use of the Supreme Court. In the late 1800s, the Supreme Court has really been on the side of Native Americans. But really, that starts to change in the early 1900s. In the case Cherokee versus Hitchcock of 1902, the Cherokees, one of the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma, tried to challenge the idea that they could not live as they pleased. Hitchcock was just a member of the federal government at that time. So this is a Native American tribe taking the federal government to the Supreme Court. More significantly, the next year, in the case Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, the Supreme Court makes a decision that shows it's going to change its attitudes towards Native Americans. Lone Wolf was the tribal chief of the Kiowa tribe who signs the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. Now that treaty states that if there's going to be any changes, 4/5 of the male population would have to assent to any changes. 80% of the Kiowa tribe's male population would have to agree, yes, we want that part of the treaty to change. Now the US government obviously ignores this when introducing allotment policy because they make changes to the reservation of the Kiowas without their permission. So the case revolves around the fact, can the federal government ignore treaties that have been made previously? The Supreme Court rules in favour of the federal government, and this sets a precedent that means the federal government is legally able to ignore all treaties that have been made with Native Americans. In fact, it goes further. The decision states that Native Americans are an ignorant and dependent race, and they are therefore reliant on the federal government, In fact, it even goes as far to say that treaties can be broken because the Native Americans are so ignorant and dependent they can't be trusted to look after themselves. The federal government needs to do it for them. This is a significant decision in the history of native rights. Treaties can now be broken. They've been broken anyway, but now there's no legal recourse to challenge this. We then have the Muskogee Convention in 1905. This is a convention of the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma. If you remember, they were included in allotment policy for an extension to the Dawes Act, known as the Curtis Act of 1898. Now, by 1906, Congress announced that tribal councils and communal lands would be abolished in the Indian Territory, which is where those 5 civilized tribes lived. As a reaction to this, these 5 civilized tribes had already started to meet in 1905 at the Muskogee Convention, Muskogee being a town in the Indian Territory. And they proposed quite a radical solution. They said, why don't we become part of the United States of America, but our own state will belong to us and we live as we please. They wanted to call that state Sequoia, and the members of those tribes voted in favour of this idea. Congress completely ignores it, and instead they set up the state of Oklahoma in 1906, ignoring the idea that Sequoia could be established as an Indian state, only for Indians. Lastly, we see one example in this time of Native Americans trying to organise themselves. The Society of American Indians was formed by 50 educated Native American men and women. It was the first intertribal group, and they campaigned for better education and healthcare. However, the Society of American Indians is not very successful. It's a first, but it fails largely for 3 reasons. There's a lack of funds, there's a lack of mass support from Native Americans, and they're really quite split on their aims. Should they, as a society, go with assimilation and make the best of it, or should they resist it? And there's tensions within the group about what the overall aim should be. What I'd like you to do is pause the video at this point, and I'd like you to spend 5 minutes thinking about what these examples show us. If you need to go back in the video and look at it again and make some notes, feel free to. But I'd like to know, what do these examples show us, do you think, about the nature of federal government attitudes, of the Native Americans? What inferences can you make? Pause the video now and come up with some ideas. Okay, here's some of the things that I got. I thought the first thing was this. I think these examples show us that being tribal by nature means the Native Americans were not able to present a united resistance to government policy. It was tricky for the Native Americans to put up a fight when they were often divided amongst themselves into tribes. They would have to overcome that kind of cultural history of being tribal in order to work together. Secondly, this shows us that when the legal system was used, it was weighted in favour of the government's position. And that is especially true in the early 20th century. That Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock decision is highly significant. Thirdly, Native Americans are split on their aims. Because at this point, assimilation has been the goal of federal government policy for decades, and so it's had an impact. In fact, many people who are part of the Dawes Act and have had their allotments for 25 years may already be citizens. So do they want to go back or carry on forwards? Number 4, the government are still willing to impose their plans on Native Americans. They're not particularly interested in cooperation or consultation. And then lastly, there seems to be some sort of inevitability to further assimilation. This just seems like it's going to continue to happen. And then number 6, negative attitudes towards Native Americans are still very prevalent at this time. Now, your job is to think about, well, to what extent did attitudes start to change in this context? You've been sent a bit of reading, and what I'd like you to do is to turn that text into a logical spider diagram. It covers the period 1900 to 1933, and I think you need to mention 4 main things. You need to know about the impact of World War I. You need to know about the Merriam Report. You need to know about Ada and the Dance Order, and you need to know about the Indian Citizenship Act. This will likely take you about 20 minutes. So pause the video here and then make notes on those 4 areas. Okay, in our next lesson, we're going to go through and think about, well, to what extent did attitudes change in the early 1900s? I'd like you to come with some thoughts on that. So, the last thing you need to do is to think about the things that you just noted down. And here's some of the headlines. Your job is to just start thinking about, well, to what extent had attitudes changed? What I'd like you to do is think about a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being attitudes have not changed at all. 10 being, yes, attitudes have completely changed. I would like you to avoid numbers 5 and 6. I don't want you sitting on the fence here. What I'd like you to do to finish is choose a number and simply justify it. To what extent did attitudes towards Native Americans begin to change in the 1920s or around the 1900s? So choose a number, and I'd like you to write a short paragraph saying why, and next lesson we're going to go through this. Once you've done that, our lesson's finished. Thanks everybody.